we'll dive into the detail. Conscious of time, and I suspect there'll be some Q&A. So I'll let Sam give the disclaimer up front on what we are not giving here.
Yeah, so basically, look, we want to be as helpful as possible, but fundamentally, before you do anything, you should pay someone for some proper advice, because then they are legally on the hook for it. This is just our best understanding. Sam obviously works in this space a lot with all the startups he does and the founder work, and I'm a consulting CFO and have experience of a lot of this stuff. So this is very much our personal experience, not advice for your situation. That said, done.
Good, well caveated. Good stuff. So, yeah, the reason for this session, I guess, we had, and Paul mentioned it a minute ago, starting to stand up was just a wonderful way to start Wednesday morning. But a few weeks ago, we had a conversation on the different option types, and it became apparent, there are loads of them out there. There are 7 different option types we're talking through today, and I'm sure there are more that we're not covering. So yeah, we thought it'd be worth outlining what the different options were, the pros and cons, and where they can and can't be used. We're going to keep this very high level, so we're not going to dive into the difference between unrestricted market value and actual market value and growth shares and all those kind of things. But we will give you a flavour for each of the different option schemes. And as Sam said, whatever option scheme you choose is going to be relatively complicated, and you're going to want to seek professional advice. So what we thought we'd do to start is talk about, firstly, the principle of reverse vesting, then talk through each of the 7 schemes, and then we'll kind of rattle through the slides quickly so we can get to some Q&A at the end, which will really put Sam and I on the spot. So firstly, let's talk about incentive use case. Sam, do you want to cover this one?
Yeah. So inherently, you're going to want to have different people involved in your business, and the types of people and the way that you engage with them will determine how you incentivize them. So for example, you can see there's a list on there, but a contractor who's doing a one-off piece of work, you're probably just going to want to pay a one-off fee, for example. If you've got a co-founder, they're probably going to want to take equity, and they may not have a salary. Employees, you'd expect to have some sort of salary, possibly with some sort of equity share as well. NED might also have a combination, but they're all slightly different. And so for all of these cases, there are certain things where you can only use them for some of these. We'll cover different things, but there isn't one size fits all. But the important thing is just to bear in mind, think carefully about who you're wanting to incentivize and why, because that will determine which of the options may be the most suitable for you. Over to you, Sam.
Back to you, Sam.
Sorry, it's me. Yeah. So I'm just going to come over the vesting. So I run a couple of companies myself. I'm starting a startup. At some point I may well be giving employees a bit of equity, but I don't want to give them all equity on day one, because if they walk away, I've just given them away with equity and haven't got anything for it. So normally there's a system called vesting, and what that means basically is that, let's say you have your shares vest over 2, 3, 4, 5 years, and so if they work 1 month and leave, then they only get 1 month out of 5 years worth of shares, right? So 1/60th of whatever you allocated them. So that means it massively de-risks it from a founder perspective, because you then know that you're reasonably, you've got the levers. And there's different ways of doing this. One is simply that you just have it vest, and as long as they're working for you, it vests. The other is that you do something called reverse vesting, where basically you give them all the shares on day one, but you have the option to buy them back, and those options elapse. The reason for doing what sounds more complicated is potentially to do with tax reasons, which I'm not going to get into here, but just to make you aware, there's this concept that you don't need to give, certainly for employees, you don't need to give your shares all on day one. Founders might be slightly different. And so if I just use the example at the bottom here, there's a founder who awards 500 shares to Jane Smith with the option to buy back over 5 years. At the end of year 3, they decide to part ways, and so 200 shares get bought back. That's quite a simple one. I at a practical level have a normal vesting with one of the companies I work for, so it vests over 12 months for a percentage of the company. And so when I complete my year, I will then have all the shares with the conditions that are attached to them. But that's the concept of vesting. It's high level. I realize I'm happy to take more questions on the end about it if it's still not clear. Sam, do you want to do the deferred bit?
Yes. So so there are a few ways of doing reverse vesting, and to summarize what Sam said, reverse vesting is basically, if somebody is going to own shares over a period, but you give them all the shares up front to avoid, well, A, loads of paperwork, B, potential tax and valuation implications. So option one is doing a share buyback, where somebody buys the shares, the unvested shares, from the recipient at some point in the future. The problem with that is, in some instances, and this isn't advice again, it can create a tax implication for either the person who's acquiring the shares from the exiting person, or the person who's losing the shares. So those crazy lawyers have come up with a concept called reverse vesting using deferred shares, which isn't appropriate in every instance, but is in some of the schemes we'll cover today. And in some of the schemes today, it's just unnecessary. But reverse vesting using deferred shares, effectively, rather than buying the shares, the unearned shares back if somebody leaves early, those shares flip from being whatever they are, ordinary shares or whatever, into something called a deferred share. And the deferred share is, for all intents and purposes, junk. It has no dividend, no voting or capital rights, with some caveats. But technically that person still owns shares. So there's no shares changing hands. Therefore, there's no stamp duty. There's no CGT, there's no tax implication of any kind. It's just a really nice way of removing any economic or voting benefit from the shares without creating a taxable event. So, and we'll come to this later. You can use it in conjunction with, for example, potentially SEIS and EIS investment. In some of the schemes, such as EMI Options, we'll come to in a minute, it's just not necessary to do this.
Okay, so founder shares. So who's it useful for? Well, founders. Typically, this is, if you're, the advantage of issuing shares on day one is that you don't have any tax implications of doing that. And you may want to give these for business critical staff. They're usually fairly simple to issue because you just literally use a sort of a few standard forms. This will probably be when you create your shareholders agreement if you don't already have one. You might need something called co-founder agreements, and that's basically you're giving someone quite a lot of equity in your company potentially. You'll typically give it to them on day one, but there will be conditions attached to that so that they can't just walk away. And as I've noted there, you can consider reverse vesting depending on the relationship. Advantages, as well as the simplicity and the lack of tax, you can actually potentially get entrepreneurs relief. So typically, if you've got a large amount of equity, if you're founding the company or one of the early founders, then there is a tax on gain, which can help with CGT and things. However, you just need to be aware that co-founders agreements can be complex. And you just would need to be careful about any further shares. But typically, that's sort of your standard share issue. Nigel, you've asked about sort of timing about founding the company after you can issue founder shares. There isn't, founder shares are basically ordinary shares. So you can issue ordinary shares at any point. The question will be, does HMRC think there's additional value to it? Because if so, they may try and claim you've been given value and therefore you need to pay some tax. But there is no technical time limit on issuing ordinary shares. Over to Sam.
Okay, so now we'll talk about EMI options on this page. So of all the options we discussed today, this will almost certainly be the most appropriate for most people. You can see here in the normal format, we outline that it's useful for full-time or nearly full-time employees. There are certain caveats around the organizational size. So you can't, a company can't be worth more than 30 million already. It's got to have less than 250 employees. So there are exclusions on qualifying trades or excluded trades. So, for example, if you're running an accountancy or lawyer firm, you can't make use of the EMI options. But for the vast majority of options where founder shares aren't appropriate and an SEIS investment, which we'll come to at the end, aren't appropriate, EMI option is the scheme that you should be considering as a de facto standard. That said, I mean, both Sam and I have, the two Sams have created EMI option schemes in the past. And they are actually quite painful, they're cumbersome and expensive to run. You need to define a scheme up front, you need to get a valuation. Every time you want to issue shares, you need to get a valuation agreed by HMRC, and then you have yearly reporting. So you are creating a layer of administration on top of your business. And for this reason, so to give you an example, when I created an IT business many years ago now, we deferred the creation of an EMI option scheme for a couple of years, because for the first 20 employees, it just felt like a cumbersome process and a big expense. And then when we had a critical mass of employees, we put the option scheme in, and then you have to put up with kind of the admin from there. But generally, the EMI option scheme is the most efficient from a tax point of view, even though it's one of the most cumbersome out of all of the options. So this is an example of, so why are EMI options? I keep mentioning that they're efficient. What does that look like? So in this example, so on the left example, Lewis is getting £60,000 and sorry, is on £60,000, and on the right we've got Elizabeth, who is virtually identical, gets the same number of shares under the same circumstance, and then you can see towards the bottom we do a tax calculation. So this is all based upon the value of 15 grand at grant, and then a sale price of the business of those shares after 2 years of owning the shares of £200,000. And you can see the difference in outcome. So probably worth skipping all the way to the bottom. But once you take into account the kind of employment rated income tax, national insurance impacts, and the capital gains tax impacts difference between having an EMI scheme and an unapproved scheme, you can see that under the EMI scheme, there is £18,500 to pay. So it's not tax-free by any means, but it's relatively efficient. And you can see on the right-hand side, poor Elizabeth, who received options under an unapproved scheme, she ends up paying £64,000. So that brings to life, when we're talking about the tax efficiency of these kind of schemes, hopefully that brings to life, you know, the difference between EMI and an unapproved option scheme.
So if you can do EMI and you've got the ability to do administration, that's great, but often people aren't eligible. So for example, I often work for companies half a day a week, and I do various other things. And so because I don't spend the vast majority of my time, all my time on one company, I'm not eligible for EMI. So I have growth shares in one or more companies. They also can work for sort of investors, and we'll come on to that. But the simple principle is, let's say you've been running a company, I don't know, you've done your first seed investment, so you've got a value of the company that you put at, I don't know, 2 million. If you then give someone shares for free, HMRC will turn around and say, you've given them shares for free, but they're worth, you know, a share of 2 million. We want the tax on that because you've effectively given them income. And so to avoid that, there's something called growth shares, which basically says, these shares I'm giving you, you're not entitled to that first 2 million, say, or your share of it. And so what it's doing is effectively carving out so that your shares are in theory worthless, or just worth the amount you pay for them. So that's what's called a threshold value. It might be the amount you raised at 2 million. It might be slightly more to be safe. It might be slightly lower. This is an area of a bit of black arts and dark arts in terms of what that number should be, because it's a little bit of a sort of second guessing how HMRC will come back and basically trying to make this robust. So, you know, lawyers will have a view on this when you set it up, but this is, you need to set up a separate class of shares, so you would need lawyers. But once you've got the class of shares set up and the valuation done, you can issue them in, you know, one go with the hurdle. And, you know, if it's set up right, then there's, you know, you shouldn't have any income tax on the issue of shares. You don't get necessarily the CGT relief you get with EMI, so you still have to pay tax on the gains. But, you know, this can be consuming to administer and you know, and challenging. But the key thing is that people do get invested in the growth of the company. So, for example, you know, I work for a company called Amplify. I've got growth shares over a certain value. Like, I am incentivized to do a good job for them and make them, help them grow, because I need them to grow well above that value in order to realize the value of those shares. I won't get as good tax relief, but, you know, that's the price of not working full time. So the concept can be relatively simple. The execution is a bit fiddly and needs lawyers.
So looking at the next scheme, so in practice, this is very rarely seen in startup companies. So a CSOP is a grown-up version of an EMI option, effectively. It is a government-sponsored scheme, so it's well-defined in legislation. It is less cumbersome to manage than an EMI option scheme. The paperwork requirements for HMRC are relatively less, and the tax incentives are relatively good, though nowhere near as good as an EMI option scheme. It is less optimal than that. There are some limits worth knowing about, which means that a CSOP isn't always applicable depending on the business. So there's a £60,000 limit per employee, for example, which for a normal employee that would be great, I'm sure. But if you're trying to incentivize a senior manager or sales director or somebody at board level, that is unlikely to cut the mustard. But it is well suited, so it's well suited to big organizations with lots of employees where you want to give relatively small options to tens of thousands of people or whatever. The other crucial downside is options must be granted at market value, so you can't discount the allocation of shares. So people are you only start at that value there. A very strong positive is this can be used in virtually every type of organization. So there's no restrictions, around size. It can be used in listed companies. There are relatively few disqualifying phrase. So it is a nice catch-all, but this would probably be my last choice out of everything we've discussed so far. It's kind of a catch-all where EMI options don't work and maybe growth shares aren't appropriate or whatever.
So again, another one that is not likely to be relevant for people, but just for completeness, so that everyone is aware, there's something called Save As You Earn. Typically, you find it at UK PLCs. It is possible to use this if, for example, you grow reasonably quickly and decide you want to list on AIM or something as a small company, which some quite early stage companies can do. But you need to do. There's all sorts of work you need to do. The advantage of that is people can put money away in a very tax efficient manner because it's basically just taken off their salaries directly. So you put out £500 a month of your salary goes into buying shares, and then you're able to trade them after a certain period on a stock exchange. Oh, Sam, you've lost the presentation. There we go. But yes, it won't generally be useful for you at the beginning, but worth being aware of that. If at some point, I've talked to one startup this week that is listing on a small stock exchange, and so they might choose to use this as one option, but for most people this won't be relevant. So over to you, Sam. I can't remember what's next.
Yeah. So this is the last option you will be. I think it's the last option you'll be glad to hear. Is incentivizing others using SEIS. So this is absolutely not a catch-all. There are lots of scenarios where this just doesn't apply. For example, if you're an existing director in a business, or you're an employee of a business, or you're a family member, of an existing director, then this SEIS scheme is just not applicable. However, there is really good, it can be used really, really powerfully in situations where appropriate. Effectively, what you would do here is a very, very low valuation funding round for people that you want to incentivize. So, for example, if you're running a business, you're a year or so in, and you want to bring on a marketing director, CTO, or whatever it happens to be, you've got lots of options. We've covered 6 other options on how to get shares in there. But one potential option is to do a very low valuation, £1,000 valuation funding round, have them invest £10 or whatever, and you would get a percentage of the shareholding into their hands in a very tax efficient way, both going in and potentially on exit. And the benefits, everybody knows I love discussing the benefits of SEIS and EIS, but the benefits are obvious in as much as there are no employment related taxes when you're making the investment, because it's deemed to be an arm's length transaction. PAYE and NIC and those kind of things don't come into don't come into account. And also when there's an exit, there's no capital gains tax to pay. So you don't dip into your entrepreneur's relief. There's no, it's not even 10%. There is absolutely no capital gains tax to pay. And as an example, so the rules have changed a bit now, but I invested in my IT business back in 2013 under SEIS, and it was great. I put £20,000 in or whatever. I got half of that money back under the SEIS scheme. But crucially on exit, there was no tax to pay at all. There was no capital gains tax. There was no entrepreneurs relief. There was just not. And you can't do exactly what I did back in the day, but you can do something very similar as long as people aren't already a founder. So this is a really, really efficient way of incentivizing founders that aren't yet part of the team, but also NEDs, advisors, partners, and anything like that. So it's worth reiterating, it's absolutely not appropriate for all businesses or circumstances. But when this is used correctly, it is by far the most tax efficient way of incentivizing others. And depending on the circumstances, this can be much more advantageous even than founder shares, because there's that kind of CGT exemption without having to rely on entrepreneurs relief, which, as we all know, is capped at $1 million. One more non-tax advantage options. There you go, Sam.
This is basically just anything else. So ultimately, you can design a scheme that you want. Obviously, just make sure it's it's not tax evasion. But you can design the scheme that you want. It will give you great flexibility, but you may create tax liability. So it's just being aware that if you go off and do something of your own creation, you probably want to seek advice on that, because you might accidentally create tax liabilities that you need to pay and declare. That's basically, and I think that was the last of the slides that we're doing, but I can't remember. Do you want to check, Sam?
Yeah, it absolutely is. And I guess the other the thing to bear in mind here is the tax liabilities aren't just on the person that you are issuing shares to. You can, depending on what tax elections, etc., have been made, you can create liability for the business as well. And if you're looking to take on a fund, if you're looking to do a funding round, or you're looking to exit, you will be giving warranties and potential indemnities, saying that that these schemes either don't exist or you have to declare them, which may make your business become attractive. So I think you need to be very, very careful. If you're ever going to exit the business, ever going to take on funding, you need to be really careful of which options here you choose, because your potential investor or acquirer will really care about the tax liability that you have potentially created. So that is all we'd hope to cover today. If I stop sharing, and hopefully we can dive into the Q&A.
That was fantastic. Thank you, Sam. Brilliant. And it worked very, very well. One quick question for me before we start. Will you be able to share the slides with us so we can share them with everyone in the startup community? Is that okay?
Yes.
Any questions? Gareth.
Inevitably. Love that. Thank you, chaps. Really helped to clarify some things that I wasn't certain on, so I'm glad I attended. Valuations. Can you speak a bit to the valuations obligation, frequency, typical cost of doing so, implications?
I think so. I'll defer to Sam in a moment, but this really depends on the scheme, Gareth. So SEIS, for example, are taking one of the easiest option there to discuss. Your valuation is deemed by HMRC to be an arm's length transaction, and the valuation is whatever you set it. Now, I think if you set a valuation of £10, HMRC would probably query it. But there are examples that have been to tax tribunal and HMRC have lost, where HMRC have argued that you can't set arbitrarily low investments at low valuations, and like I say, HMRC have lost. So you've got flexibility there. Whereas EMI Options, there is a prescribed process by HMRC where you define the valuation, you submit it for HMRC rubber stamping, and quite often they query it. Quite often they'll dig into the calculations. You'll have to evidence and justify the valuation, so you'll have to provide management accounts. Potentially, if you're in 9 months into a year, you'll have to provide management accounts or last year's filed accounts. So it is HMRC don't just arbitrarily accept any valuation you put in front of them.
Do they have to be
Again,
third-party
totally
audited? That was. I was triggered to ask the question by Giancarlo, who mentioned the vested process, and vested as one of the providers that offers a valuations process, so that it is third-party verifiable for HMRC. Is that mandatory or is that optional?
No, it's not mandatory. So the thing is that ultimately valuation is not. So the word audit implies there is something that you can check and absolutely confirm. So people will be able to say it's not bananas, but no one can confirm that's the correct value, because what someone will pay for it might be different to what someone else will pay for it. So, you know, this is a grey area where what you want to do is ensure that, you know, if you had to stand up in court and justify it, you're not going to look silly, right? So that there'll be bits like, just as Sam referred to about EMI, what you'll do is you'll create your valuation, and, you know, it may be accounts. If you've got historic accounts, it may be your forward-looking model, and then how you base the valuation on that. You know, if you've just done a raise and then you're issuing EMI, that's a very, very clear marker point, and it's quite hard to argue with, because that's, you know, if an external third party has done a very clear arm's length transaction, it's very difficult for HMRC to push back on that value. It's the only reason they can push back is if they don't think it's really arm's length and you've somehow wangled around that, like with some dodgy deal going on. But yeah, there are people who will do values. The lawyers can come up with sort of simple valuation methods, and any people like Vested or anyone like that will have you know, plenty of other providers, I should say, but they will have valuation methodologies to help you through with that.
Though to be clear, Gareth, when Vested or any of the other providers, your accountant, your lawyer or whatever, provide a valuation, Vested aren't considered independent for any purpose for HMRC. They're seen as acting on behalf of the company that do it. So HMRC, yeah, will query Vested's valuation as much, valuation calculations as much as they would your account, because they're not an arm's length third party. Ultimately, Vested are paid to do that on your behalf.
Super and interesting.
There is a difference. So we didn't dive into the detail, but for EMI options, for example, you get the difference between unrestricted market value and actual market value. And this is, so to Sam's point, if you've just done a funding round and your valuation's been set at 2 million, trying to argue to HMRC that your valuation is 100 grand is going to be a challenging situation. But what you would do is say that your unrestricted market value is £2 million. I've forgotten the example I gave. But then you can argue that the actual value given to the option holder is much less. The actual market value is reduced by, you know, the shares aren't generally tradable. You can't just sell your shares. They may have restrictions on voting rights. And obviously they're an option rather than a share as well. So that they don't have dividends and things like that. So what you do is you may be hampered by having a relatively high valuation due to having just completed a funding round, but you can argue that down based upon the restricted nature of the shares, the fact they don't vote, the fact they don't have dividends, and so on and so forth. They're actually worth less than the kind of 2 million valuation. Does that make sense?
Perfectly. Thanks, guys.
Thanks, Gareth, for your question. Damien?
Hi, Sam. Thank you for that. I got a question. Just you had on the EIS, SEIS that basically less than 30% of the shares. And I was just wondering whether that was the first 30% of the shares, or whether that's just a 30% of the shares. So I'm in a situation where I've already got, a founding partner, I guess, who has a share of the business, like 10% of the business. So am I still free to issue another 30% under SEIS?
Yeah, so the rules are that you are, it's not 30, there's no, the 30% restriction is no person using the SEIS and EIS scheme can own more than 30%.
Oh, I see.
So as long as one person individually doesn't tick over that level, you can have, in a normal arm's length investment scenario, you can have more than 30% invested as long as it's not just in the hands of one person, if that makes sense. Does that answer that, Damien?
Yep, thank you.
Thanks, Damien. Giancarlo.
Yeah, I just wanted to connect on the thing of valuation because we are pre-revenue. This is why I introduced Vested, because we're using Vested platform. This is something I've been talking about probably in last week in terms of what is valuation? Do we need a valuation? How is Vested with HMRC? Because we are on the startup plan, so we have growth options, and that's the only thing we do. So basically, for our collaborators, we are releasing growth options with vesting or milestones or a combination of both. And but now we have, for example, one of the team that wants to invest in us, basically wants to help us, giving us some money and getting a bit more of shares. And after speaking with Vested, but mostly after speaking with our accountant, I don't know if it's useful for someone, but because we are very far away from revenue, basically, or for having any value that can be sensible for the company. Basically, they said that we don't need an official valuation, that as long as the other party it is okay with what valuation we are giving them. So I don't know, if you give me 50K and I give you 2%, whatever it is, then they say that it is the easier option basically to use the growth shares at the moment before going into SEIS and all the other things that we will need later on. Obviously, once we are launched, we have revenue, and then at that point we have a way to basically have a valuation. So yeah, I just wanted to add what's been my experience, and if anyone has something to add on it, if it is correct, or if there are things that I know we should just look for, or yeah.
I mean, the immediate thing that just springs to mind is, obviously you've got people working for you, and you've got the valuation, but and they may want to put money in, which was wonderful. You've got that commitment, but if they're just putting in money and they don't have sort of that sort of founder's relief or whatever, then they will pay the CGT on the shares. So if they're an employee, and you can do EMI, that might be a more efficient way of doing it, but it might not be, and they're equally so. The way you work, you're quite right. Like if someone's willing to put 50,000 in for shares, ultimately that's an arm's length, as long as that's seen to be arm's length and reasonable, and you can justify it. If HMRC do an inquiry, then, that's your thing. But just bear in mind that there are, to Sam's slide earlier, what you do now affects how much tax you might pay down the road, as well as what's happening now.
Okay, yeah, thank you.
Thanks, Giancarlo. Gary.
Sam, really good presentation, and I'll come up with quite a few questions, but a lot of them are related to what I went through at Halo. So the first question is, this is for a new company, vesting for employees. Do employees see it as this benefit that if they're vesting over, say, 3 years, that they give up so much in that first year that they then could get let go, so they lose them shares? That was one of the problems. And also, what happens to them shares? Do they go back into the pot? Because technically, if someone don't make it to year 2 and 3, everyone benefits from getting the dilution, if you know what I mean. So that was my first question. Then it was on to the 10% entrepreneurial relief. Is it correct that founders have to have more than 7% to then get that relief? Because when we started Halo, we was founders of 6, we had less than 7%. So actually, although we was founders, I believe they would have gone to make loads of money, we wouldn't have got entrepreneurial tax. So that was the other question. And the other one is Companies House. Does this all have to go through Companies House as well? Because how do you put it through Companies House and then vest it back afterwards? Lots of questions, sorry.
Yeah, if I can jump in first. I thought the ER limit was 5% on employees, but that could be
yes.
Yeah, so I think it's fine. I think that's
I think it is.
Yeah, from 7 to 5%. So yeah, lots of really interesting questions there around a scenario you've actually lived through. There are different types of EMI options. So bear in mind, when you are issuing options under an EMI option scheme, to start with, people are just getting options. They're not getting full fat shares, which has a number of implications. Every time I have seen an EMI option scheme, and there are rules around a 10-year limit here, but every time I've seen it, the options never convert to shares unless there's a liquidity event. So, which is a really nice way. I put it on the slide, but I didn't call it out individually. That's a really nice way of creating golden handcuffs, so that people know that, so you as an employer know that if somebody leaves, they're not taking shares with them. The options, I think under the EMI scheme, they have to die. So an employee can't keep them post, post their exit if they leave employment for whatever reason. So lots of employers don't have options that turn into shares until there's that liquidity event, just to prevent the problem of, issuing a whole bunch of shares. As soon as people roll over to their, year 3, and then they physically own the shares, they can go and get another job knowing that those shares are safe.
Thank you, Sam. I think it was more understand the option schemes. I understand that 10% would probably sit somewhere else. Yeah, it was more of a case of when you're starting a company with founders and then you're doing reverse vesting for them. What happens when the chances are 1 or 2 of them might go after a couple of years?
Yeah, so the shares just return. The shares, technically, it depends how you do it. If you do a buyback, then they'll sit in as treasury shares or whatever. If you're flipping them to deferred shares, which is the kind of ruthlessly tax efficient way, then technically they sit on the cap table. Technically, they still exist and they're still linked to your name. But for for valuation purposes, and when people are doing the calculations of who achieves what on an exit, those shares don't benefit under a liquidity event, and therefore they're not considered as fully diluted capital in the company.
If I can come in as well to your point, Gary, about the dilution. So whatever, like on an EMI scheme, for example, an EMI scheme might be set up so that the board say that you can issue up to X number of shares for employees, and therefore, whilst on the one hand those people leaving means that there are fewer shares or share options in circulation, it doesn't mean that that won't be used up on the replacement employee. For example, if you need to get a new employee to come in, that you'll clear all those shares back, but then you'll reissue them to the person coming in. So there's not a kind of incentive to try and get rid of people to improve to reduce the dilution of your shares. And the point about vesting is very much that, because if you've got a founder coming in, the advantage of founder shares is that you can vest them over a period of time so that they've got something for their effort. And the idea is fundamentally, if someone's contributing to the business on an ongoing basis, then they've got that. Now, if for some people, if you consider them absolutely business critical, you may have to give them non-vesting shares. You may have to take the plunge and go, right, well, we're co-founders, and then you would lock them in with a very tight agreement that doesn't have vesting. So it depends on business criticality and the established of the relationship, and all sorts of intangible factors as to kind of what might be right in any given situation.
Though to Sam's point is that you may give people unvesting shares from the start. And then your investors may insist that all founders, it's typical when you do a funding round, that investors will insist that everybody is subject, all founders are subject to vesting. So, typically when you incorporate a business, you and your co-founders, there would be no vesting arrangement in place. And then as soon as you do a funding round, certainly, using standard paperwork from us, the Articles of Association layer on top a set of vesting rules that you probably never had on incorporation. And that's because your investors system is just a completely market standard to have some vesting on those founder shares. And going to your point, Gary, around do unallocated options help not dilute people? That was an interesting. So when I had my exit, we'd carved out 100,000 option pool. We'd actually only issued 80,000 shares or whatever. And the benefit of those 20,000 unallocated, those options never turn into shares, and therefore they reduce the dilution, back to your point, on everybody pro rata to their shareholding. So there is a benefit to not having kind of unallocated options. And if you were a cynical employee and fired your whole workforce the day before a transaction occurred, not that I'm recommending this, but those options wouldn't convert into shares, and therefore they wouldn't be diluting your proceeds on exit. So, although
you probably have a constructive dismissal lawsuit for the value on your hands very quickly.
Yeah, it would be a disappointing outcome. But just to make the point that unallocated options and options that are returned to the pool and not reallocated, you get the benefit as a founder by the increase in the reduction in number of shares and options in circulation.
Yeah, thanks, guys.
Thanks, Gary. Graham.
Quick question from me from a B Corp perspective. Have you ever helped any B Corps who've looked to do the employee-owned IBM, and which route they take, sort of conscious that the options wouldn't be seen by B Lab as strictly shares until obviously they crystallise and stuff? So just interested to see if you've dealt with or helped anybody on that route.
It's not something I've seen. I don't know if Sam has.
So, I mean, I run a social enterprise, and so one of the things that I've been basically using the similar sort of like methods, you know, in exactly the same way for, I've just issued someone with some, like a small percentage of equity vesting, you know, over a number of years. You know, so it's exactly the same method, and it's just simply, you know, the HMRC don't distinguish between, you know, because the main reasons for different structures is about, you know, what control you have, what ability you have to sort of retain that economic interest, and what the tax implications. And as far as I'm aware, HMRC don't care whether you're a B Corp or not. The only difference is if you're a charity, and then their shares don't apply. So, you know, if there's tax, B Corp doesn't give you a specific advantage. And, you know, for my social enterprise, I use exactly the same thing, you know, that we're talking about here.
It was more the threshold in terms of the analyst giving you B Corp certification as to what they expect to see as being proof they actually have the shares, because obviously it's a certain percentage the employees must hold, and it's as to where the threshold crosses between, you know, option to actually have, if you like.
I mean, that's not something that I've done, but I imagine what it sounds like you're asking for is a sort of a verification service. There are sort of company secretarial services that sort of can do kind of independent verification of, you know, the shares that are owned by a company, but that's less to do with the issuing methodology and more to do with yeah, a sort of audit trail.
Okay, right, thanks.
Thanks, Graham. Well, that's been very, very useful. A brilliant session. Thanks to you both. And we're going to give you lots of big ups and love on LinkedIn today. If anyone within Start to Stand Up wants a connection or an introduction to either of the Sams, please let us know, or obviously get in contact direct. But that's been very, very useful and insightful.